How will that in any way work for any kind of national service or services that cross borders, be it metropolitan or national? How's that going to work? I'll start with you, Mr Lynch, and work way across.
Well, I
think I might know your answer.
I think it will be chaos, but I think the government is only concentrating on what they perceive to be England. You know, they've got this idea that as long as you keep certain routes happy, their hinterland will be okay.
That's it, Mick Lynch. You take no prisoners. Well, hello then, I do hope you're all well. Now is this our working class hero, Mick Lynch, at his brilliant best, where he was at a Transport Select Committee meeting on Wednesday, where he was also with General Secretary for ASLEF, Mick Whelan, and Rob Jenks, the Policy Officer for, is it TSSA or is it TSSA? I can't quite remember anything where. But they were there to discuss the subject of minimum service levels for the railways, you know, due to the railway strikes. Well, striking everywhere out there. And as always, our Mick Lynch didn't disappoint. So enjoy, my friends.
Mr Lynch, do you have any different points to...
Well, we will never support minimum service levels. It's undemocratic. It's unconservative, in my view. It goes straight to people's right to combine and to be democratic and have their freedoms expressed in a free democracy. And you're oppressing that. You're the Conservative government. And this goes back to the foundations of our democracy. Toll Puddle, the Combination Act and all the rest of it. This is your latest version of the suppression of the right to people to organise.
Just to be clear, this committee is not introducing anything. We're
well, yeah, but you'll get to vote on it, so maybe we'll convince you to vote against it. That'll be the ultimate outcome. So we'll never support it. It won't work. It's going to make things worse. And they were being very careful earlier about what they do. But you've got to remember these people are under a direct instruction from the DfT, from the Transport Secretary. They have to comply with what he says. They've got no right to diverge in any way from the thinking that's coming from the DfT and from BIS at the minute, because they're under state control, which is a strange irony at the minute. You're getting evidence from private sector companies who are under direct state mandate, and you're empowering the state to tell people, to conscript people to go to work when they voted not to go to work under your legislation. So it will never work, and it will create more problems. It will be unsafe. Conscripting people to go past their own union's picket lines and operate complex signalling systems or drive trains is a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. I don't know why you're doing it. Nobody else does it. All this stuff about France and Europe. If you've seen the industrial action in France in the last few months under alleged minimum service levels, they have completely novel ways of taking industrial action, including occupations and blocking tracks and all the rest of it. What you will do through this process is create novel industrial action. If we can't use traditional industrial action as you've been used in Britain for a long time, there will be novel forms of action, and there will be wildcat action, which is what happens in France and Italy and Spain and elsewhere. In Stockholm last week, there was walkouts all over the Stockholm tube network outside the legislation. So it's going to come back on the Conservative Party's heads, I believe, but it won't work whichever way you go with it. And of course, we haven't got legislation. We've got the slimmest piece of legislation that many people remember. We're waiting for regulation to come out of the minds of somebody in the Department of Transport or the BIS department. And we don't know what we're dealing with anyway.
Well, and that is the purpose of this inquiry, excuse me, is to explore what that regulation might look like. We're not debating the principles of the...
Shouldn't they be telling us rather than us telling you?
Well, we are questioning a wide range of witnesses and looking for their input. So in terms of shaping what those regulations might look like, are you engaging with the consultation process? Do you have a role in that?
Well, we've responded to the consultation, but we still don't know what's going to happen. So you could have a completely novel situation where we give 14 days' notice of strike action, and then, as we understand it at this time, the government or the companies give us 4 days' notice inside that 14 days of who's got to work. So it might be quite novel, whereas the companies are always taking us for injunctions. We may have the opportunity to take them for injunctions if they haven't served the notices properly. So I think it's going to be a complete pig's ear. But we will respond, and it's the stuff. It's unsafe, we believe. It's not going to work, and I don't think it will serve the passengers well. And if it's going to go to a national reduced timetable, people like train drivers and signallers will be completely conscripted. You cannot run an 80 or 90% or even a 50% railway service without conscripting all of the signallers and all of the controllers to operate that network. If you want to run a train down into Cornwall, into the north of Scotland, into rural Wales, and all of the towns that were mentioned earlier, Stoke, Middlesbrough, Portsmouth, all poor towns, by the way, I noticed. Maybe that's why they're not getting a service. I'm sure Guildford and Maidenhead always get a service during strike days. But it will be a disaster, and we'll all end up in court, and they'll spend even more money on fighting these cases than they have in trying to break these strikes. And if they'd used a fraction of the money in breaking the strikes in regard to settling them, we could all be back at work now anyway.
Mr Lynch, anything to add further to what you've said already on some of this, but also you've touched on the lack of information, or we're waiting for the regulation for this fairly small bill as it stands. What's your level of expectation and the level of detail that you're going to be privy to from the Secretary of State?
Well, I think they're going to make it up as they go along. It's just a suck it and see piece of legislation. I don't think they understand the railway. I don't think the people in the Department for Transport understand the railway. They've got 60 people working on the current dispute, which has obviously been a raving failure. If they want to then go into the actual operation, the nuts and bolts of how you operate a railway on a strike day or during any other industrial action, I think they'll be completely lost. So I think there'll be a lot of backtracking and reversing. There'll be a lot of pressure coming on them from passenger groups, devolved authorities, national governments, as you've mentioned. I think it's just going to be a mess. I don't think anyone actually knows how this legislation is going to be formatted. And I think the worst part of that is it's the people that are in charge seem to have the least idea. That's why they're floundering around asking everybody else how they should conceive their idea. So I'm as wise as anyone else. I don't know what's going to happen. I do know that some of our members are going to be served with notices to go to work. And if they don't want to go and they refuse to go, they will probably be sacked. And that will poison industrial relations with the people that you've just had sitting here every day of the year. If they sack 500 of my signalling members, well, we're going to be in an absolute crisis. If they sack 30% of all the drivers in the country because they won't go to work across their own picket line, where are we going to be on the railway? It will be a permanent disruption of our railway. Then we'll have to have disputes about getting those people re-employed. We'll have a P&O situation where everybody's getting sacked because they won't break their own strikes. I don't know if that's what the government wants, but that is very likely to be where we go, because we will have a strategy of non-compliance because it's an unjust law.
And obviously I made the point already that the First Minister's said to the STUC that it wouldn't be implemented, not a single work notice would be issued in Scotland and whatnot. And if Wales were to take the same approach, and potentially whatever devolved authorities, London, whatever, where there is semblance of local control, how will that in any way work for any kind of national service or services that cross borders, be it metropolitan or national? How's that going to work? I'll start with you, Mr Lynch, and work way across.
Well, I
think I might know your answer.
I think it will be chaos, but I think the government is only concentrating on what they perceive to be England. They've got this idea that as long as you keep certain routes happy, their hinterland will be okay. And I don't think they care what will happen in Wales and Scotland. That's my perception. And the railway has taken a decision they don't particularly care about it during the disputes. And this is the current dispute, which is sponsored by the government and paid for by the taxpayer, is a DFT Westminster dispute that affects communities outside of that prerogative. And I think this is largely concentrated on that. And I think we'll start another constitutional issue. If the Scottish Government says we don't want that, they'll soon be pressing further for the devolution of employment law. And then we'll have further conflicts where people involved in a strike in Scotland could be treated differently than people on strike in Newcastle or Carlisle. It's creating more of a mess than we've already got.
We've been pushing for devolution of employment law for some time, including firing, rehiring and everything else. Mr Jenks, you get anything to add to that?
I don't think I have, actually. I think Mick's perfectly well covered it. Yes, it's about how it's going to affect, well, your understanding of the moment in terms of the legislation, how it's going to affect your members. And that could be, I mean, people refer to signallers. Is it going to compel signallers to work? Are they going to lose their right to strike, for example? How will it affect the routes and different employers?
Well, if we move on to the example of London Transport, might be useful, because we've spoken a lot about the mainline railways, often called, but the more you think about it, if they command the London Mayor or TfL to run a service, I don't know, 50%, and they've got to open all the subsurface stations, every single grade on London Transport, London Underground, will be affected. So all the drivers will have to go to work, I would imagine, to run that service. All of the customer service people will have to go because they're safety critical in the sense of running the subsurface stations, the escalators, fire drills, and some dispatch roles. And all of the signalling staff and control room staff will have to go to work. So that will be a complete conscription of labour, and it will nullify the strike. So you won't have the right to strike. So it is a network. It's not called a network for no purpose. You cannot simply say, I've got a load of drivers that I've commanded to go to work. The railway will just run. And you've heard that even from the employer. So everywhere you look, it will end up with multiple grades, and perhaps the only grades that will not be conscripted will be the management grades that are currently operating the railway when we're on strike. It's quite a strange situation. An ironic outcome is that the people that are currently breaking strikes won't have to break strikes because they'll compel the people who are on strike to break the strikes. And that's a bit of a strange situation. So I think all grades will be affected in all of the companies, but I don't really think anybody knows at the moment how it will work. Well, I think it will be seriously detrimental. I mean, we speak to Tom and Jamie and all the others all the time, fairly cordially. And I think during these current disputes, it's the credit of everyone, to be honest, that there hasn't been a breakdown of relationships at any level, I don't think. If Tom and Jamie and others start sacking our people as a result of taking lawful industrial action, that will lead to the complete deterioration, because we will not be able to sit with them when they're either being forced by the minister or by their own volition to sack our people for taking what, a month before could have been lawful industrial action. That will lead to a complete breakdown. I don't see how we'll resolve any disputes if hundreds of our people, maybe thousands potentially, are being booted out. It's just not going to help anyone. I don't think they want to be in this position, if I'm honest with you. I've sat with all of these people for many hours over the years. Not one of them has said to me they want this power and this legislation. They've got no idea how it's going to work, as you've heard, and they are being press-ganged into it as much as anyone else. I don't think anyone wants to be in this position, because if they don't sack people, what are they going to do? You're putting yourselves in a position where you're given an instruction by the Secretary of State to carry out a minimum service level, and if it doesn't work, what's the Minister of State going to say to you next? He's going to say, or she's going to say, I want those people sacked, so that the next time they come to work. I don't know if you politicians want to put themselves in that position, where they're commanding chief executives to dismiss people for taking strike action. But that's the road you're headed down. You're interfering directly into private businesses about how they deal with their staff, collectively and individually.
Let me give you a scenario. So a signaller has been served the works notice, and there's a picket line, and they refuse to cross the picket line in this democratic state we call Britain. And what are the legal consequences for that signaller, and what are the consequences for the travelling public?
Well, they lose their indemnity. We don't have a right to strike in this country. There is no right to strike whatsoever. You breach your contract of employment every time you go on strike, and you're indemnified from legal or disciplinary action by the public, by businesses and by your employer. They will lose that indemnity, so they can be subject to the costs of the disruption, and they can lose their job, and they could potentially end up in court because of the costs. So this goes back to the Taff Vale judgment in 1913, when it was my union that was subject to that, by a coal company taking our union to court, nearly broke the union, which was the object. That's where we're going back to, but you'll also be picking on the individual. So they will be sacked. How we will get ourselves out of that position if all of those... You put the company under pressure then, what are you going to do about it? These people defied that work notice, having voted to go on strike. I mean, some of you lot will have to work that out for us. You are the people making this decision, and you're the one that are going to put ordinary women and men in this position with their employer, and the employers will be in a similar position, an invidious position, where they've got to make these choices under pressure from the government and by the Secretary of State, who goes on the television and says, I'm just a good broker. I put these people together in a room and I hope they can find a way, which is completely untrue. It's in the passenger service contract. They're going to go further than just being involved in the negotiations. They're going to be in the disciplinary procedures as well, pressing them to be dismissed. Yes. It's the inevitable outcome. Now, the effect on the public will be that it's likely to come to their town. If they work in another industry and there's more industrial action, the government will extend these powers, but it won't resolve the current dispute we're still in, and it won't resolve future disputes. It will make them intractable, I think, because the first thing the unions will say is, we will not leave victimised members behind. That's where we'll be.
Final one to you, Wal. Are you going to challenge this legally?
Yes.
Yes? And what routes are you looking at the moment? What are your options?
Well, when somebody writes the regulations, we might know. We're all in this position, aren't we? But we will do whatever we can. We will take, and we'll urge the TUC to have a non-compliant strategy. Hopefully we'll do that collectively, so we can do that in the European Court. We can do it in our own courts, depending on how these work notices work. If you look at the history of the legislation since the Tebbit laws, I'm not going to go back over all that, but all these iterations of the laws, they've all ended up in court. They've all ended up with challenges from employers, challenges from various parties. Then you end up with a bit of equilibrium. You find out how it's going to work with all the ballot thresholds and all the rest of it. It settles down, and then the government comes back, or one government comes back and makes a new set of legislation because they weren't content that the unions had defeated or got round the previous legislation. I imagine we'll be involved in that for the next 5 to 10 years. Until somebody serves a work notice on a group of workers, we won't know what the challenge will be. So there are people in certain inns of court around here that will be rubbing their hands, thinking this is great, this is a new area of law. I'm sure the Tories were elected on the basis that they were going to get rid of red tape. But you're bringing in a new set of law that all these lefty lawyers, as you call them, can challenge. So that will be an interesting development.
And it'll also be intriguing to see
Have you got any views on that question?
Well, I don't know if it will provoke people. At the minute, people who aren't in unions have the right to go on strike, by the way. And I don't know who they're going to pick for a work notice. So if the RNT was on strike and other unions weren't, are they going to put work notices on everybody in case they don't cross a picket line? Because you have the right, as a non-trade unionist or a worker in another union, to not cross a picket line and be protected and indemnified. So I don't know if anyone's thought about that maybe everybody won't come to work. And maybe all the people that aren't in the union won't come to work because they won't get a work notice. Who knows? Will the employers demand to know who is in a union and who is not in a union? They don't have the right to know that at the moment. So I don't know how it's going to work. I don't think anyone else knows how it's going to work, which is what's wrong with the legislation.
Do you think it would differ if it were different types of workers on strike? Because obviously we've got we've got train drivers, we've got, as you say, signal operators, things like that. Do you think this legislation would work differently for different types of workers?
Well, I imagine the employers will prioritise who they want to work. So if I don't suppose that they want somebody in accounts. They're that bothered about whether they come to work or not on a strike day. I'm sure they'd like them to. But they certainly will want signallers and train drivers and conductors to come in. But there are lots of other people out there. And it depends what the strike is, how many people are involved, which grades are involved. So if you take a London Underground strike, they tend to be a coherent group. If you've got train operators, it could be one train operator on strike, another train operator not on strike. But they are often co-located. and they get knock-on effects. So I've got no idea what the effects will be and how they will deploy their powers. I'm not sure the people that are writing it know how they will deploy their powers either, because we haven't seen any of the powers, as far as I know.
Two different subjects I just want to touch on, but firstly, safety and access of vulnerable people. You heard in the earlier discussion that, you know, I know there have been concerns raised, particularly by the RMT, about where safety would be in this situation. And in the previous discussion, they gave us reassurances that they didn't think that would be the case. Do you agree with that situation?
No, I think they gave you a reassurance to do a risk assessment. So what they do at the moment, when they're getting managers to break strikes, is they put them on a training course for 4 hours, which for a safety critical member of staff would be at least 6 months or maybe a year. And then they put them out. So what they'll do is risk assess it, and they would come up with a risk assessment that says, we don't think there is a greater risk, or the risk can be managed. So that's just health and safety speak for saying we'll just take the risk. And so if we stress safety critical staff by making them come to work on pain of being dismissed, they will just say that's no greater danger. We think they will continue to take that risk. I think they will probably continue to use managers fairly extensively where they can, because I think they're reasonably comfortable with the situation at the moment. I mean, during this dispute, Network Rail sets down the minimum standard that they're going to run, which could be 20-30%, as you've heard, and they will try to operate a system within that, and it's got a defined time period. Now, they seem fairly comfortable with what they're doing. I don't know what your impression was. And I don't think this adds any value to them, but it certainly will put people who don't want to do the work into a stressful situation where you're putting pressed people into safety critical roles, and that shouldn't happen. So that is an enhanced safety risk. But they'll cover themselves with paperwork and say, we did a risk assessment.
Oh, I'm sorry. So just to try and paraphrase what you're saying, that they will be saying that they are operating at appropriate safety levels, but your interpretation is that at the very least it's a poorer safety level than you would normally be operating at.
Yeah, it imports risk by having people who are pressed to work.
And just a similar related subject before I go along to your colleagues there. In terms of the access for vulnerable and or disabled passengers, do you think they'd be able to manage that in the situation where you were in a minimum service level? Do you think there'd be any impact into that?
Well, the only way you could manage it adequately is by compelling more people to come to work. So much of the infrastructure is Victorian or of that area with lots of steps and footbridges and all the rest of it. That needs passenger assistance because the lifts aren't there. You will have to get people who people are maybe not thinking, like customer service staff who are not safety critical. If you want to keep that service going, you will have to bring them in. And if the government dictates that more stations should open on this timetable method rather than the priority route, that will mean more people being compelled to come in.
Just on a completely different subject, obviously, you know, members of the public may have sympathy with your strike action, but for everybody, we all get into our own place. We always get into our ability to get to our jobs and things like this. And what the government's putting messages out there about, you know, putting minimum service levels in so they can help the essential workers get to work or whatever. What do you think the public actually would expect should these minimum service level things be delivered? Now, notwithstanding the complexities of delivery and all that sort of thing, but what do you think the public expectations are that based on what government communications have gone out? What do you think the public is actually seeing this? What would they expect to see?
Well, I think there's a danger that you're going to raise expectations through this to a level that will not be fulfilled. It's ironic, of course, that...
Yeah, the second part of my question was whether the expectations are realistic, so yes.
Yeah, when it started, we were told the essential workers have been held to ransom by RMT and others, and of course all those essential workers have now been on strike themselves in the course of this action. So I think what the public, in my view, really dislike is when they're told this level of service is going to run and it's not fulfilled. And so I think there'll be even more anger when the chaos that's inevitable comes around and there's not a fulfilled minimum service level for whatever reason, not just us, but simply because nobody understands what they're doing, and I think there'll be more anger, and that's what we'll see.
In the evidence, you point out that this proposed legislation is unfair, undemocratic, unworkable and unsafe. Now, in response to questions from my colleagues earlier, from Paul Howell in particular, to the train operators in the first panel, they implied that there were no safety concerns that hadn't been addressed to ensure the safety of the network. Do you have any further views in relation to that? I was thinking, and I raised this with the rail freight operators, about that dreadful Southall train disaster where a good friend of mine was killed a number of years ago. Is there some response you want to give for the record in relation to the safety concerns?
Well, I think the way that the railway works is that the duty holder, as they call them, has to be satisfied themselves that they will run a safe railway inside the legislation and inside the standards. And they decide whether that's true or not based on risk assessment and contingency. And then what's called the regulator, people assume this regulator goes around approving. They don't. They only are satisfied post-mortem, if you like, if that's where it comes from, that they did all that they should have done and they couldn't have foreseen it. So it's up to them to decide whether they run a safe railway. But if you want to run the railway on this basis, you will have to compel the fleet engineers to come in, which is my own grade, who then hand over the trains to the drivers, and then all the other grades will have to be satisfied, all their employers, and it's a multi-employer situation. They'll all be satisfied that they've got a safe regime. And if it all goes wrong, they will just say, well, we were satisfied at the time that we did what we can. But they've never factored into this the notion that you will compel these people to come to work. At the moment, nominally, the managers that are operating the railway largely, who are being incentivised, £500 a day, are willingly breaking the strikes. Yeah. It's a different scenario where you've got people who are unwillingly breaking the strike, and we think that is an inherent danger, either through stress or some other factors that they've got to bring into their safety critical work.
Are you having discussions with other agencies about the safety aspects of this? Have you raised your concerns with them?
Yeah, we called a special meeting with the ORR, the Chief Inspector, and he was I don't want to put him on the spot, but he was as oblivious as the rest of us about how this is going to work. But he outlined what I just said. We will engage with the employers and the companies and see that they've put safe systems of work in, but they will just fudge over the issue about what it is to be compelled to go to work during a strike.
Well, you think it would be the issue would be in sharp focus for the ORR because that was set up after those series of terrible train disasters, wasn't it?
They don't work in forward. They work after the fact of an incident.
Yeah. Just in conclusion, I wonder if I could just ask you, because when we've put this to ministers about why is this legislation being brought forward, and they've said, well, it's the norm in Europe. What discussions have you had, either through the International Transport Federation or through other organisations, with what is the situation in other countries, where they have sectoral collective bargaining and so on?
Yeah, most of those countries. I'll get out of the way in a minute. Most of those countries are covered by sectoral collective bargaining, so it's a different scenario. And as far as we've been informed by fellow trade unions, there has never been an enforcement of any of this legislation in any of the countries where it exists. As you say, it's honoured in the breach. But they do have a different formula of industrial action. So being on strike, en grève in France is a completely different scenario than we have, whether it's in America, Ireland, Britain. That sort of English-speaking world concept of trade unionism and industrial action doesn't apply over there because they go for completely different scenarios. And they're allowed to strike against a lot more things. We can only strike against the employers. They go on strike against the government and all sorts of situations. And there were no minimum services in France recently.
Now, if you didn't watch the full meeting, I'll leave a link down below in the description box. Or even if you want, I'll I'll leave a link somewhere above here for the live stream that I recorded on the same day. Either way, it's well worth a watch because both Mick Whelan and Rob Jenks, with Mick Lynch, are full value as well and absolutely brilliant. Now, on Sunday, again, I've been invited to appear on the fantastic Sunday roast, my friends, and I'm so excited, as always, because it's so nerve-wracking for me, because everywhere I look, I'm just sort of like seeing one of my heroes, one of my inspirations, just like watching through your fingernails, nerve-wracking. And on Sunday, this will be no exceptions as a guest who will be appearing. Every day's a school day for me, even for this old duffer like myself. But anyway, I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to step on other people's toes. But I shall leave the video here. Take care, have a fantastic weekend, and watch out for Sunday roast because you certainly won't be disappointed, my friends. And I shall bid you farewell and take care and see you Monday.